The human brain is the most complex object we know in the universe, and we have only recently begun to learn about its mysteries. With advances in science and technology, this becomes even more amazing, because studying the brain essentially means that the brain is studying itself and trying to figure out how it works. It is not known if people will ever fully understand how their main organ works, but people will definitely strive to do so. In this video, we will talk about it. These are 10 interesting facts about the human brain. The history of human study of the brain goes back centuries, but the understanding of how important this organ is relatively recent. In ancient Egypt, for example, the brain was not considered to be something valuable and important. During mummification, the heart and other human organs were taken out and embalmed separately, as it was believed they would be needed for the person in the afterlife in one piece. The brain, on the other hand, was simply taken out with special tongs through the nose and discarded. The Egyptians thought it was just filler for the cranium, which had no important function. After all, it was in the heart, in their opinion, that man's soul as well as his consciousness was located. Perhaps the first serious thinker to consider why the brain was needed was the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, who lived in the 5th century BC. He did not carry out any scientific experiments on the brain. All his speculations were speculative, but in many respects, he was right. He believed that the brain is the receptacle of the human mind, that it is responsible for human perception of the world, and that epileptic seizures occur in humans precisely because of defects in the brain. The great philosopher Aristotle also had his own view of the brain, but it proved to be erroneous. Aristotle, like the ancient Egyptians, believed that the heart was the receptacle of the mind, and the brain was just needed to cool the blood that flows through the head. In the 2nd century AD, there was the Roman surgeon Galen, who treated gladiators. In his spare time, he dissected dead monkeys, dogs, and other animals to study their internal organs, especially their brains. You may ask why he didn't dissect dead people, but that's easy. Already in those days, religion was hindering science and forbidding the dissection of human bodies. So he had to make do with animals. He came to the conclusion that it was the brain that controlled muscle movements through the nerves that ran through the body. And back in those days, doctors believed that mentally ill people were possessed by demons or some other unclean force. The Christian church generally thought so until the 19th century. But the Persian physician Avicenna, who lived in the 11th century AD, came to the conclusion that this was due to diseases affecting the human brain, and even developed methods of treating these illnesses, which, however, were terrible and ineffective. But it was to his credit that he came to his conclusions about the true nature of mental illness. Living in a world where everyone around him believed in spirits, magic, superstition, and other paranormal things. During the Renaissance, the Belgian physician and anatomist Andreas Vesalius performed public autopsies on human corpses because it was more tolerated in that country. By doing an autopsy of the brain, he realized that the brain is not just a monotonous gray mass, but that there are different structures there that appear to be responsible for different functions. Leonardo da Vinci was also interested in the brain and made stunning anatomical illustrations, which he had to hide because in Italy he could have faced the death penalty for such an act. With the advent of powerful microscopes, scientists have discovered that the brain is composed of special cells, neurons, which are connected to each other. This is the key to how memory and thinking work. Modern technology, such as magnetic resonance, allows scientists to study the brain while it is working, studying which regions are more active during certain human actions. We already know quite a lot about our brains, but we seem to be a long way away from fully understanding all of their mechanisms. Hallucinations are when a person sees things that are not really there. They usually occur in people with mental disorders or after taking specific psychoactive substances. But there are ways, unrelated to the use of something, which cause our brain to generate hallucinations. In recent years, a practice called floating or sensory deprivation has become very common in many countries. If you translate the term into plain language, it means isolating a person from any sensations or stimuli. A person is immersed in a special sensory deprivation chamber, essentially a large capsule filled with warm salt water. While staying in such a capsule, a person is in the dark. No sounds penetrate there, and the salty, warm water makes you feel as if you are in weightlessness. So, after some time in such a capsule, your brain, deprived of any stimuli from outside, begins to create various visual images that you see. That is, hallucinations begin. All large cities now have such chambers, and many people go there to relax. By the way, a long time ago, about similar sensations told the prisoners who spent a long time in the punishment cell, that is, a small room without any light and weightlessness. There, of course, they did not feel, but they often saw hallucinations, because it is difficult for the brain to be without visual stimulation for a long time. So it starts to create such stimuli by itself. But to achieve this effect, it is not necessary to sit in the dark. There is another way. You take one ping pong ball and cut it into two halves. Such halves are superimposed over the open eyes. Light passes through them, but a person's gaze cannot focus on anything, as a result of which the brain also begins to create various visual images that a person can see. It is possible to trick the brain in other ways not related to visual perception. For example, there is such a concept as the grid illusion. Here's what it is. A special surface consisting of long strips of metal is needed for the experiment. The strips alternate with each other. First there is a warm strip and then a cool strip. They are exactly warm and cool. That is, they are not hot or icy. There are no red-hot or icy streaks on this surface. If you put your hand on such a surface, it will hurt. Your brain will receive information from the receptors in your hands that it does not understand, so it will interpret the sensation as touching something hot and make you pull your hand away. Sound hallucinations can also be induced by a special room with perfect soundproofing. The vast majority of people cannot stay in such a room for more than half an hour because they become terribly uncomfortable. In such a room, they get to hear how their digestive system works, how their joints crunch, and how the blood flows through the arteries to the head, and the pounding of the heart becomes very loud. But those who endure this torture of silence eventually begin to hear sounds that are not actually in the room. People talk about clearly hearing the buzzing of bees, the hum of a crowd, and various songs and music that sound as if they were for real. There is hardly anything worse for her than physical pain. Even though we feel pain in many different parts of our body, our arms, legs, or stomach, it's not really there, but in our brain. Our brain interprets the signals coming from different body parts and organs and makes us feel pain. But the interesting thing is that there are no pain receptors in the brain itself. That is, if you open the cranium of a conscious living person and poke a stick or needle into his brain, the person will feel absolutely nothing. As scary as it sounds, some brain surgeries are performed without anesthesia, and the person is conscious the entire time. In these pictures, you see the patient playing the violin while the surgeons operate on his brain, and in this picture the man plays the guitar. And then there's a very rare genetic disorder that affects only a few hundred people on the planet. It consists in the fact that a person has no ability to feel pain at all, even if he dips his hand into boiling water or cuts off his finger. It may seem like the ultimate superpower, but it is far from it. The life of such people is extremely dangerous, especially when they are children. Such children are very clumsy, constantly falling and hitting themselves because they do not feel pain, and therefore do not understand that such situations should be avoided. Often they twist their joints, hurt themselves, and do not even notice it, which can cause inflammation or blood infections. As adults, they constantly have to examine their bodies for wounds and bruises. Pain is an important mechanism that helps living things avoid danger and harm. Pain is also an important symptom in various diseases. If a person no longer feels pain, he or she will not be able to recognize that something is wrong in his or her body. People with a genetic disease tend to live much shorter lives on average than normal people because they are more likely to suffer life-incompatible injuries. It would be nice if, in the future, science could find a way to significantly reduce the pain perception of normal people by 80%. However, it is very dangerous to live without pain at all. As I said earlier, the human brain is the most complex object in the known universe. Not surprisingly, this organ has become surrounded by a large number of different pseudoscientific but very popular myths, many of which a large number of people take to be a long-known fact. The most popular such myth, perhaps, states that a person uses only 10% of his brain. Sometimes a value of 5 or 7% is found. This myth is especially loved by various trainers and personal growth, motivational speakers, and spiritual gurus who claim to know the secret that will activate the brain to 100% and give a person incredible superpowers. There are even courses online on how to do this with meditation and spiritual practices. I've even met people who have condescendingly asked me like, Didn't you know that scientists proved long ago that humans only use 10% of their brain? Of course, the reality is quite different. Modern science knows that we almost always use our brain to its fullest potential. It can be compared to muscles. We don't use every muscle at every moment. If we walk and do something, in one way or another within a minute, we are using almost every muscle in our body to do it. And we know this because of technology such as functional magnetic resonance, which scans our brain and lets us know which parts of it are active at a certain moment in time. The brain is an organ that consumes up to 20% of all the energy in our body. That's a lot. Why did nature's evolution give man such an energy-consuming brain if it is only used at 10%? Another very popular myth is the belief that all people are more developed in either the right or the left hemisphere of the brain. If the left hemisphere is more developed, then the person is prone to mathematics and logic. And if the right hemisphere is more developed, then this person can hardly count at all and is prone to creativity. He has a well-developed imagination and fantasy. However, if this were really true, then all the people around here would be conventional artists or mathematicians. But this is obviously not the case at all. This myth originated in the middle of the 20th century. In those days, there was a special way to treat epilepsy: cutting open the corpus callosum, that part of the brain that connects the right and left hemispheres. Once the corpus callosum was cut, the cerebral hemispheres practically stopped communicating with each other, and therefore the epileptic seizures stopped. However, there was a side effect of this method of treatment as well, so you can guess and study these side effects. Scientists were diligently engaged at the time. It turned out that a person with a split brain essentially begins to have two different consciousnesses, which sometimes do not coordinate their actions with each other at all. Man is built in such a way that the left side of the body is controlled by the right hemisphere of the brain, and the right side of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere. The same is true of the eyes. Researchers have found a way to show different images or objects to only one hemisphere, so that the other hemisphere doesn't see it, which has led to some very interesting findings. To begin with, the left hemisphere of the brain is responsible for speech. So, if you show some object to the left eye of a person who is connected to the right hemisphere, and then ask him what he sees, he will answer that nothing, because the left hemisphere, which can talk, is connected to the right eye and really sees nothing. But a person with a left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, will be able to show that object in a picture, because the right hemisphere of the brain, though it cannot speak, is responsible for the visual perception of objects. These experiments on people with split brains combined with others have shown that each hemisphere is responsible for certain activities. Each has its own functions, but popular psychology has simplified this concept by declaring the left hemisphere logical and rational, and the right one creative and illogical. In fact, all people have a lot of dominance. The left hemisphere of the brain is responsible for speech, but in general, both hemispheres of the brain in a healthy person are approximately equally developed. As in the case of the 10% myth, this is confirmed by brain scans with MRI scans that show brain activity. That is, there are of course people who are gifted with creativity or mathematics, but this does not mean that one hemisphere of their brain is physically greater than the other. As I said earlier, it is not known whether humans will ever be able to completely unravel all the mysteries of the brain and know absolutely everything about how it works. There is even an assumption that no system can know itself from within. It has been argued that if scientists could learn to create fully functioning brains on their own in the same way that people now create computers or other electronics, we might say that people have fully understood the human brain. However, this is a long way off. It is worth saying that modern laboratories are already growing living brains, but very small ones. These mini-brains are called organoids, and are grown in test tubes under special conditions from human stem cells. These are cells that can later develop into various other types of cells, such as neurons, brain cells, and scientists know how to do this. The result is a mini-brain. Of course, this is more just a structure made up of brain cells, not a full-functioning brain with different parts. But such organoids still allow scientists to observe the activity of these cells, their development, and the resulting knowledge correlates with how a real human brain works. And this is interesting. There are discussions in the scientific community about how ethical it is to grow such mini-brains at all. Imagine a brain devoid of any stimuli from the outside. That is a kind of consciousness that is in a void and does not understand what it is and who it is because it has no body. However, it is highly probable that such mini-brains have no consciousness and feel nothing. This is evidenced by the same MRI scans of brain activity, as well as by other means. Nevertheless, mini-brains are not allowed to grow indefinitely and are destroyed after a certain period of time in order to exclude the possibility that at some point they will develop to the point where they become capable of feeling and awareness. If a hard object hits you in the head and pierces your brain, you are likely to die, whether it is a bullet or some sharp, long object. Nevertheless, there have been several instances in history in which a person has survived such an injury. Perhaps the most famous such case that went down in the history of medicine happened to an American builder, Phineas Gage, in the 19th century. And he managed not only to survive, but also to help science learn something very important about the brain. In 1848, he was working on a railroad construction project and was horribly injured there. During an explosion, a long metal pin drove into his head and pierced it through. The pin went through his skull below his left eye and came out through the top of his head, flying out completely and falling a few feet away from Phineas. He eventually managed to survive, which is already very surprising, but of particular interest is the fact that this injury changed his personality. Before his injury, Phineas was in good standing with his colleagues. He was a responsible, responsive, and pleasant person. But after the injury, as his friends and family report, Phineas became, shall we say, a man of very difficult character. Because of this, he could no longer work on the construction site with his co-workers, as he became rude and defiant. He also suffered from amnesia for some time after his injury. Overall, however, this did not prevent him from leading a full life. He lived another 12 years after his injury, working as a cab driver. He also appeared in public several times as a live exhibit. Such entertainment was popular in those days. After Gage's death, his body was dug out of the grave to get his skull for study. The skull is still preserved in a museum in the United States. This case confirmed the speculation of scientists of the time that damage to certain parts of the brain could affect human behavior. In this case, it was his social skills. Head injuries can lead to the most tragic consequences, which is why you should always take care of it. Wear a helmet, settings, or helmet when riding a motorcycle. But modern medicine knows several stories when a head injury suddenly opened up superpowers in a person. And no, these are not stories from comic books or yellow newspapers, but real documented and studied cases. Let me tell you a few such stories. In 2002, an American named Jason Page, then working as a furniture salesman, was robbed on the street. The robbers threw him to the ground, brutally kicked him, and took all his valuables. He went to the hospital with a serious concussion. After he regained consciousness, he discovered that something had happened to his vision. He began to see strange lines and symbols in the air. They turned out, he said, to be geometric shapes that illustrated various mathematical formulas. This enabled him to quickly solve various mathematical problems and equations, even though he had not previously been distinguished by his knowledge of mathematics. He was examined with a functional MRI scan, and the results showed that when he saw mathematical formulas on paper, Jason had a particularly strong activation of the area of his brain responsible for processing visual information. That is, he can actually see what normal people don't see. Another similar case happened to another person in 2006. An American named Derek Amato jumped unluckily into a pool upside down. It turned out to be very shallow, and Derek hit the bottom, suffering a severe head injury. He was paralyzed for a while, after which he learned to move his body again. In doing so, he acquired a superpower. Namely, he became a virtuoso pianist. Although, until then, he had only known how to play the simplest melodies on the piano. He also began to write music for the piano. After his injury, he gained the ability to play a particular piece without sheet music, simply by listening to it once. However, the injury caused him to have constant pain in his head, and also, oddly enough, his hearing deteriorated. There have been several dozen other such cases in the history of medicine in which trauma has opened up a person's brain to a particular kind of creativity. Mathematical abilities appear much less frequently as a result. The American Orlando SRL was injured in 1979 while playing baseball. Because of this, he developed the ability to memorize information perfectly. For example, he could study a map of some city for 10 minutes, after which he was able to name all the streets of that city and which street intersects with which street. He could also quickly tell what day of the week it was, for example, January 8th, 1823, and so on. This superpower is called savant syndrome. It occurs in people without any head trauma and has been present since birth. Such a phenomenal memory may seem like something very useful in life, but it is not. People with savant syndrome are very rarely able to use this ability for anything other than demonstrating it to others. They are rarely able to turn it into information and valuable skills. Modern technology makes it possible for a person to live without certain organs, at least for a while. For example, an artificial heart that pumps a person's blood during a complex surgical procedure. If doctors living 200 years ago had been told that a person could live without a heart, they would never have believed it. It is quite possible that, in time, technology will be able to replace other human organs as well. And then the question arises, what is the minimum required set of organs for a person to live and think? Most likely, purely theoretically, it will be possible to limit ourselves to one organ, the brain. Imagine if in the future, it would be possible to put your brain in a special nutrient solution, connecting it to a device that would pump blood through it to the neurons. Your brain would be hooked up to a computer that would generate an electrical impulse, and in such a way that you would have the sensation that you have a body, that you can see, hear, and feel. Because all of these sensations are really created by our brain based on the sensory information that it receives. And the body. Here are philosophers who have long wondered about the fact that, in fact, we can't be 100% sure that we are no longer these brains in jars that are connected to a computer and that our outside world is real. And even if our world is real and we are not just brains in a jar, it is very likely that in the far, far future, it will be possible to connect the human brain to a virtual world in which this brain, without a body, can live, experience any sensations and experiences. However, it seems to me that in such a case, many people would voluntarily accept having their brains done to them in this way, because it would give them the opportunity to lead a virtual life that was not available to them in reality. Today, I have a question for you on this subject. Would you be willing to trade your real, not perfect life for a virtual one, but full of joy and positive experiences? And if not, why not? Write your answers in the comments. I read them, and they also help a lot to promote the video. And next, I suggest you watch my videos about hackers and scary science experiments. The links will be right on the screen. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos. Bye.